Bose described the spiritual wife doctrine, or as he termed it, universal female prostitution, and warned his readers to, quote, take care of their wives and daughters and preserve them from ever being contaminated by the pestilential breath of adulterers and fornicators, end quote. The theme of illicit immoral activity in conjunction with the temple ceremony certainly continues to the present. For example, the movie Temple of the God Makers discusses what they call, quote, bizarre secret practices, end quote, in the temple, and later referred to the Mormon concept of eternal life as, quote, endless celestial sex, end quote. Judy Robertson, in her book, Out of Mormonism, A Woman's True Story, also discussed parts of the temple ceremony and described being in almost a trance-like state during a large portion of the ceremony in which she, quote, felt defiled, ashamed, and bewildered, end quote. 19th century accusations of licentious temple ceremonies, as well as the accusations of spiritual wifery and religious prostitution, were increased an hundredfold with the 1852 public announcement of the doctrine and practice of polygyny, or plural marriage. During the next few decades, a particularly colorful and interesting genre of polemical literature arose. This was the narrative genre of kidnapping, seduction, rape, and bondage. Most of these stories had a certain format which was, ironically enough, borrowed from 18th and 19th century pornographers. This format involved the following. The story was related in the first person. The story involved kidnap and or seduction of an innocent and naive virgin to an exotic place, rape and or deflowerment of said virgin, subsequent depression and despair because of the depravity of the situation, and finally escape and the opportunity to tell all. One of the earliest and best examples of the resemblance of themes used by both pornographers and those writing sexually oriented fiction was The Lustful Turk, published in 1828. The book's plot is simple, as is the case with most works of that genre. The story concerned two young ladies named Emily and Sylvia. Sylvia was kidnapped by the Dey, or Lustful Turk, who then set up a scheme wherein she would be in a state of mind to be subjected to his desires. She was taken to a slave market where she was handled, fondled, and humiliated. The Dey then arrived disguised as a representative of the French consulate and bought her. This, he told her, was to save her from the Lustful Turk. He then arranged for a fake marriage to be performed by a fake English priest. She was then deflowered and gave a new sense of her sexuality. At this moment, the Dey revealed his true identity. Sylvia was then reunited with Emily, who had already become the Dey's sexual slave before Sylvia's own seduction. They were content to be with the Dey in a menage a trois. However, it all ended abruptly when the Dey attempted to deflower yet another young virgin and was castrated by the girl. The Turk, no longer feeling as lustful as before, released Sylvia and Emily, and they returned to England to tell all about their adventures. Now, you're probably all wondering why I am telling you all of this. You'll see. Although obviously a fictional tale, the book took on a certain air of reality by, as previously mentioned, being related in first person. This is because, quote, in some primitive way, a story told in the first person may seem closer to actuality, less invented, less a fantasy, more immediate and authentic than a narrative in any other form, end quote. For this reason, the Lustful Turk used this format. Many anti-Mormon novels had a similar format. This is particularly true with works written by former Mormons. Most of these followed the format of going to an exotic place, Salt Lake City. Yes, at one time that was considered exotic. Being held in some form of captivity, physical or emotional, witnessing or experiencing sexual bondage and licentiousness, and eventually escaping and publishing the experiences. Probably the most important convention for both pornographer and anti-Mormon writer was the image of the innocent victim, a device borrowed straight from Maria Monk's exploits in a Catholic nunnery. The main theme of Victorian pornography, quote, was the defilement of purity, and the most pure object available for exploitation was a young virgin, usually blonde, and always having large eyes, end quote. Maria Ward, in her 1855 book, Mormonism Unveiled, described her heroine as, quote, scarcely 18 years of age, of full rounded form and complexion that rivaled the peach when ripened by the southern sun, lips of the cherry, and eyes liquid and blue as the heart of a spring violet, end quote. Orville Belial's heroine had a soft and, quote, soft voice and, quote, pearly lids drooping over her dove-like eyes, while the massive golden curls fell over her brow and neck, end quote. In pornography, women are disposable. They cease to exist once they have served their purposes. In the case of Victorian anti-Mormon literature, the seduced girls almost always dies, not only heightening the pathos and stressing her passivity, but tidying up any loose ends quickly. For example, one sensationalistic tract titled Appalling Disclosures matched its lurid seductions with victims' deaths from sorrow and shame, tempered by a few who went mad. However, in these tales of pathos, there is always at least one woman who lives to escape and publish her horrible experiences with the Mormons, thus telling all. Although not as sensationalistic nor as explicit as 19th century anti-Mormon literature, modern anti-Mormon literature still uses borrowed imagery and literary motifs. For example, Utah Mission's The Inner Circle once published an article supposedly written by a concerned mother. This mother recounted how her daughter Heather, quote, who has blonde curly hair and piercing blue eyes, end quote, had been lured away from Christianity to Mormonism. Another modern example of using the narrative imagery already discussed are the two novels written by Marion Wells, whose family background is LDS, although she appears to never have actively participated in the church. Both of her historical romantic novels are cliched and excruciatingly amateurish. However, while both books use traditional imagery, such as describing the heroine, Rebecca Wallstone, as an innocent young orphan with, quote, heavy taffy-colored braids, end quote, who later travels to far-off southern Utah, neither of the books describe any overt sensuality. The books do describe Rebecca's journey to Utah, her continued questions about Adam, God, blood atonement, and other discomforting issues. She eventually fell in love with Andrew, one of the presiding elders of the southern communities, and married him only to discover too late that she was his second wife. Naturally, Wells described the misery and despair of living in polygamy. These books do nevertheless utilize certain themes and imagery mentioned above. These themes are aimed at a certain audience and are meant to reinforce already misconceptions about Latter-day Saints. Obviously, one of the main themes was the evil nature of polygamy. A sub-theme in the second book was how dirty Rebecca felt for having been involved with plural marriage and other Mormon teachings. The idea that members of the LDS Church have become desensitized to accepted mores has also been a common theme since the 19th century. For example, in The Mysteries of Mormonism, the author lamented the, quote, indecency in conversation of women and children. Several wives of one man with their children present have been known to indulge in such indecent conversation as would bring the blush to the face of a modest woman if repeated to her alone, end quote. Sexualized early, quote, urchins of 8 to 9 know more of what they should not know than youths of 16 or 18 in a refined community. They are not only afforded opportunities of thus corrupting their minds, but often encouraged to do so, end quote. Furthermore, Orville Belial, in her book, In the Grip of the Mormons, asserted the Mormons, quote, were unaccustomed to modesty, end quote. Another critic, John Benjamin Franklin, complained how polygamy made men and women lose, quote, all decency and self-respect and degenerate into gross and disgusting animals, end quote. As a result of this supposed degeneration of moral values, were, according to anti-Mormons, the existence of child sexual abuse and incest among the Mormons. Indeed, several early anti-Mormon writers charged the Mormons with practicing, quote, the fearful sin of incest, which is so intimately and closely connected with polygamy, end quote.